Hello and welcome everyone to the first event in the ICAT 2023 webinar series on trafficking in persons, data and research. I'm Dr. Phineas Jassy, Data and Research Specialist with the IOM's Protection Division based in Geneva. I'm moderating today's webinar on behalf of one of ICAT's two chairs this year, the International Organization for Migration. Before I hand over to our excellent speakers, a few words about ICAT and the webinar series for your attention. As many of you may know, ICAT stands for the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. It is a United Nations policy forum formally established in 2007 with a mandate from the General Assembly to improve coordination and cooperation on preventing and combating trafficking in persons. The group operates under the continuous overall coordination of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC. ICAT has an overall plan of action focusing on 6 priority areas, one of which is building an evidence base on trafficking in persons. The group's annual activities, however, are shaped by its chairs, which are elected on an annual basis. This year's co-chairs are the International Organization for Migration and the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. As part of our co-chairing work plan, we are, among other things, focusing on promoting data innovations and providing thematic guidance on research on trafficking in persons. This webinar series aims to do exactly that. A cross-cutting issue for all activities this year is child protection, capitalizing on the status and expertise of our esteemed co-chair. As today is the International Day for the Protection of Children, I take this opportunity to congratulate you all and to gratefully acknowledge the work many of those present here do to promote and protect the rights of children. There will be 6 webinars in this series, held between June and November 2023, and covering topics ranging from trafficking in persons, data collection tools and data visualization, to trafficking in persons, research gaps and dilemmas. Each webinar will be around 45 minutes to 1 hour and will feature short presentations of examples of current work on these topics, followed by question and answer and discussion. Different time zones will be accommodated as much as possible. This webinar is the second being held today. We had the first session in the morning at 10 a.m. Presentations will be recorded and made available for the benefit of those who cannot attend at the designated times. We also have a few housekeeping issues. If you experience any technical issues, please write in the chat and the webinar administrator will try to address them promptly. After the presentation, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand and you will be given the floor by the administrator. You are also welcome to ask questions and make comments in the chat box at any time. All materials related to this presentation, along with the webinar recordings, will be uploaded to Notes, which is UNODC's Knowledge Center on Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling, the platform which is hosting these webinars. They will also be available on the ICAT website at a later time. I'm now going to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Fabrizio Sarica, the team leader on research on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants in UNODC's Research and Trend Analysis branch. Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Finn. Thank you very much for the introduction. And my role here in UNODC is about collecting data on trafficking persons, analyzing data, and produce studies, reports, and namely the global report on trafficking in persons. And over the years, we have been struggling with the difficulties that member states, national authorities, and other institutions that are in the field of work in the field of trafficking, these challenges that these institutions face in collecting data. In the next 15 minutes, I will talk about this project activity that we are doing together, IOM and UNODC, and is about creating standards on the indicators for data collection on trafficking persons. It's the, I will share my screen now, is the ICS TIP, so the International Classification Standards for Administrative Data on Trafficking Persons. A bit of a background about this activity, this project that we are doing together. The idea came, let's say, by simply facing the fact that we, as a UNODC research working on trafficking persons, were receiving a lot of requests from national authorities all around the world to give assistance for the collection of data on trafficking persons. What are the indicators we should collect? How we should collect these indicators, and so forth. The same was happening for IOM, and sometimes we were providing different trainings to different institutions of the same countries. So we decided to get together. Let's come up with common standards on the data collection on trafficking persons. After years, this is the results. So the idea is, of course, to have common standards, common indicators to collect, of course, among different institutions and also internationally, in order to, let's say, facilitate the sharing of data at national and international level. So when we talk about administrative data, we are talking about the official recordings of certain institutions, of certain agencies, of that could be in the field of trafficking persons, of course, law enforcement, or the National Anti-Trafficking Agency, or the social workers, or those who are entitled or who are in a specific territory or community recording data on the cases of trafficking persons that are officially detected. So we are talking about cases that comes to light, and recorded by national authorities. And you know, often national authorities don't have the instruments to record this information, and but of course this is extremely needed for these authorities, and at the end, at national level, international level, to keep track with the amount of cases that are dealt with national authorities. But this sort of data, administrative data, are also used for research purposes, of course, if properly managed and properly analyzed. So I here provide some example of how administrative data are used for research purposes. We have, of course, the Global Report on Trafficking Person, the CTDC of IOM, but we also have a list of national studies that actually initiated, so to say, the analysis of this sort of data. I like to mention the Dutch rapporteur, that is probably the first example of an institution that collected and reported info and analyzed information on the trafficking in persons cases officially recorded. The German Bundeskriminalamt report, but then many others. We have good examples also in Nigeria, the NAPTIP, data set that is regularly published in the NAPTIP website. I could mention good examples also in many parts of the world, Romania, Guatemala, and so forth. So all these national reports are based on official data, officially recorded cases of trafficking, administrative data. So here also even more the importance for these institutions to have proper indicators to collect data in proper way, the proper data, and in a standardized way, so that all institutions can share information and we can all communicate data, the same information. Of course, when we started this process of developing this ICS tip, then we started to realize also the obstacles, the challenges that are, let's say, behind the collection of administrative data. That goes with data privacy, of course, the issue of lack of trust among agencies when sharing, receiving, or sharing the information. Or, of course, what I was saying before is that indicators that are not standardized are not able to be comparable. So information that is collected in certain way by the Ministry of Interior cannot be compared with the one of the Ministry of Justice, and cannot be compared by the national agency that is working on trafficking persons, because information at the raw level is not collected in the same way. The institutions are collecting different indicators. So we started to develop this idea of the ICS tip. The activity started just before the pandemic. As a consequence, also most of the activities, as many of us were conducted remotely. What we did was a lot of consultation with national authorities, with those authorities that every day do collect data on trafficking in persons, either, again, law enforcement, good example from the national agencies collecting data, law enforcement, and so forth, in different parts of the world. So bilateral meeting, sharing, collecting good example, good practices, what is needed, what is not needed, what is waste of energy. And when we talk about data collection, there are often a lot of indicators that cannot be collected, and that, of course, result in a waste of energy, a waste of time for those institutions that, let's remember, these officers are there to assist victims of trafficking, or to prosecute traffickers, or to combat trafficking in general, but not necessarily to collect data. So the idea is to give them those instruments that could help them to collect information on cases of trafficking persons in proper way. So a lot of bilateral meetings, I was saying, and then a large workshop that allow us also to share the drafts, the different draft of this indicator, this ICS tip, in a way that at the end, the final product is, by all means, the result of a very consultative process, again, with those officers that are doing this job on daily basis, that are collecting information on daily basis. We also conducted trainings in different parts of the world, namely, we have jointly, UNODC, IOM, conducted a joint training together with the African Union to the members of the African Union. I think it was in 2020. And we are also trying to coordinate the trainings, current trainings on the ICS tip. I will go in a bit, really, in the details to touch upon a bit the content of the ICS tip. What I would like to mention is that the ICS tip is fully in line with the ICCS For those of you that are not familiar with ICCS, ICCS is the International Classification for of Crime for Statistical Purposes, is a international standard that is being validated, approved by the United Nations Statistical Division. And those are standards that we promote everywhere around the world for member state institutions to collect data on crime statistics. So ICS TIP is in line with the ICCS, and the idea is, of course, to get this list of indicators also to be approved by the UN Statistical Commission itself. It allows for different level of analysis, and the approach is as such that could be adapted to different level of capacities of different institutions, and I will show the principle. The unit of analysis of the ICS TIP is the event. So one case of trafficking in persons that came to attention of national institutions, or again, those that are assisting victims or those who are combating criminals. One event, and one event of trafficking is likely going to have more victims and more perpetrators. So we have one event, then we have 1, 2, 3 victims, or 1, 2, 3 and 1, 2, 3 perpetrators. All this information is, of course, lumped together in the event, and then we go together and then we ask the profile of the victims, or indicators connected with the profile of the victims, indicators connected with the profile of the perpetrator, and of course with the entity that is reporting the information. So this is the logic. When it comes to the indicators, we have, of course, a list of indicators that goes with the sex and gender of the victim, with the citizenship of the victim, and the same goes, of course, with the perpetrators, with the age profiles, and so on and so forth. It would be impossible now to list all possible indicators, but the idea, again, is that since different institutions may have different capacities to record the list of indicators, we came up with a 3-step approach in the definition of these indicators. And we start with the core indicators, so the minimum standard, a list of indicators that is really those that are absolutely most needed, those that by all means needs to be recorded. Then step 2 would be a number of indicators that are also needed, should be collected. Indicators, of course, about the event, about the perpetrators, about the victims, about the entity. And then the third step is aspirational, of course, what would be good to collect. The step system has been designed also discussing with national authorities and realizing that we need to, how can I say, balance the need for information that is needed, of course, for policy, also eventually for policy purposes. So the need for information, but at the same time, the capacity and the feasibility for national institutions to collect this information. At this point, I will close here my presentation. And of course, my colleagues, Stine from IOM, will talk more about this and about other issues. I'll pass the floor to the moderator, to Finn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fabrizio, for shedding light on what TIP admin data is and why we need it, and also elaborating the different challenges of using this admin data. We also heard through the presentation how the ICS TIP came into being, including the guidance and the manual which is available for use by governments and stakeholders. Very much appreciated. To build on to this presentation, I'm going to introduce our next speaker for today, Stine Lawson, who is a data analyst, counter-trafficking analyst at the International Organization for Migration. Stine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Finn, and thank you, Fabrizio. That was a great introduction to the ICS TIP. I also would like to extend my gratitude to the ICAT colleagues for this wonderful initiative. So building on the ICS TIP, I'm just going to share my screen as well. We realized that it wasn't necessarily enough to have a standard. We needed something to go along with the standard in the form of a manual, guidance manual, which we've called Making Each Case Count. Not the easiest thing to pronounce if you try to say it fast. But basically, the starting point is that standards are needed to support effective and consistent data governance at every stage of the data lifecycle, but they're only part of the picture. And this is where the guidance manual comes in. It specifically targets central government agencies that are collecting data, TIP data, from a variety of different sources, in order to be able to produce evidence to address trafficking effectively across a national context. But all stakeholders who are working with administrative data might find this useful. So the purpose of the manual is to support standardization of administrative data on TIP internationally using the ICS TIP, but it's also supposed to assist and address concerns regarding data collection, management, sharing, and use more widely. The whole point of this is, of course, to produce more high quality data, which can be leveraged safely and ethically to inform policy and programming on counter trafficking. So when we talk about the data lifecycle, we talk about the different stages that data goes through. And the fundamental idea of the ICS TIP manual, or the Making Each Case Count manual, is to address these different stages. So in terms of the data collection and sourcing stage, which we consider the first stage of the data lifecycle, it takes as its starting point the ICS TIP, but it also points to the importance of identifying relevant objectives. So why are we collecting data? What's the purpose of the data that we're collecting? Which problems are we trying to address? One of the sort of fundamental parts of data collection is, of course, also don't collect data that you don't need. So this also goes back to what Fabrizio was saying before. It's trying to address or anticipate common challenges. These could be challenges such as heterogeneous data, sources overlapping coverage of data sets. We know that double counting can be an issue, ensuring that the legal basis to share data and using data downstream is in place, as well as taking into account that there might be different legal definitions or even different organizational definitions of TIP. We are, of course, also keen on discussing the ethical principles surrounding data collection. We know that TIP data is sensitive, very sensitive. It's personal data and often extremely personal data. So we're keen to make sure that principles such as do no harm, that there is a specific and legitimate purpose for collecting the data, as well as the consent, that we have the consent of the data subject to collect the data. We also want to make sure that we are following or respecting any data protection frameworks that might be in place, as well as protect the privacy of the data subject. We also meant to make sure that we're fostering trust and collaboration and supporting primary data collectors. We know that, I think we'll also discuss that a little bit when we talk about sharing, that one of the common challenges can also be the exchange of data and trust between different data sources or different data collectors. The other aspect that we want to address, which isn't a stage in the data lifecycle, but more of an overarching framework, is data governance. We want to make sure that we have a clear idea of what we're using the data for, but also the different aspects of data sourcing, data sharing, data analysis, etc. So outlining the objectives of a governance framework is something that we would highly recommend. And we would also make sure that that whatever data governance framework is put in place for TIP data, of course, is in line with national data protection and data governance frameworks. So the whole point of having a data governance framework for TIP data is, of course, to set roles and rules relating to data management and decision making. So who has access to the data, how is it shared, with whom is it shared, in what format, but also to ensure that there is consistency and accountability for how the data is used and collected, etc. So this includes sort of all necessary or relevant stakeholders. So the main purpose of a data governance framework is accountability, defining the purpose of the data, dealing with heterogeneous data set or data assets, dealing with risk, whether they're tangible or intangible risks, whether they're emerging from data protection issues in terms of government frameworks, or if they're emerging from various or tangible issues such as poor internet access or a lack of access to available to good software. And then finally, it can be a help to navigate interagency contexts, which we have realized can be an issue. The second stage of the data lifecycle is data sharing. So defining different types of data. As mentioned by Fabricio, administrative data on TIP can be coming from a lot of different sources. And what are the trade-offs between different kinds of data? Highlight general principles. This could be in terms of having legal agreements in place for sharing data, defining who owns the data, and what happens when data is shared in terms of ownership, but also providing concrete methods and good practices on the topic. We also want to point to providing useful due diligence considerations. So who exactly are we sharing with? How are we sharing it? Is it safe the way that we're sharing? Are we using password protection, for instance, to share data? Are we sharing data via email? Not necessarily something we would recommend in most cases. Or are we using cloud-based or other means? And then the final stages of the data lifecycle is the data analysis and presentation. So when we're using administrative data, we want to make sure that we can sort of situate that within a wider evidence landscape. So what exactly can administrative data tell us about, and what are the limitations, which is definitely something that we want to emphasize as well. Whenever we're presenting data to an external audience or even an internal audience, we don't want to make claims that we cannot support. So in terms of how are we presenting it? We're making sure that we're not presenting it in misleading ways. What audience are we trying to present the data to? What are the potential confidentiality or privacy risks of presenting or analyzing this data? And how do we make sure that we're not undermining the anonymity and privacy of the data subject? So this chapter in the guidance provides useful consideration and good practices in this area. I believe this is also a topic that we'll come back to in one of the later webinars. So overarchingly, it's important to point out that the manual is not proposing a universal or standardized method of organizing and prioritizing the production of administrative data. We do realize that different stakeholders and governments have different capacities, as Fabrizio also said, in terms of the different steps of the ICS TIP. And we're very aware that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to TIP data. So we don't want to suggest that everyone does it in the same way, but we also want to emphasize that there are good advice and good practices out there that can be used. So what we're aiming to do is to provide guidance, useful considerations, and examples of good practices to a wider audience. So this is the guidance manual. The next steps will be that we're making ICS TIP and the guidance available online as a working document. I believe that Fabrizio already mentioned that we are trying to get it endorsed by we're submitting it to the UN Statistical Commission for endorsement as an international standard. We're also planning more trainings, both regional trainings as well as national level trainings, and we're launching an e-learning course which will be freely available on the IOM learning platform. And then we're having additional consultations with NSOs and trafficking agencies as part of the endorsement process by the UN Statistical Commission. So some of you may be thinking, okay, this was all aimed at centralized government agencies. What about civil society organizations? In parallel with the project on the ICS TIP, or the development of the ICS TIP, IOM also worked on a human trafficking case data standard, which is a global reference for consistently defining, managing, and using victim of trafficking case data standards. And the whole point of this is to sort of more of a practical guidance. So while it's still aligned with the ICS TIP, it provides standards and resources for frontline organizations and technologists or developers who are configuring or administrating case management systems for frontline organizations of any size. The idea is to provide protection, or the target group are those organizations that are providing protection and support services to counter-trafficking organizations. It could also be technology service providers and independent software vendors. So the idea with this is that it supplements and works along with the ICS TIP. So it's aligned with the ICS TIP, but it's much more practical in many ways. The idea is that we can provide a standard and a standard set of tools for organizations that are supporting and assisting victims of trafficking, so frontline organizations. And the goal is to create case management not software, but standards that allow for the sort of following the entire process, so that from initial identification through referrals and needs assessments to the provision of reintegration support and long-term follow-up. It's the sort of idea for this. It's not based on a specific system, as you will see, but it does have suggestions to what's available and how to use them. So we realize that different organizations have different needs, which also means that we sort of took a less is more approach to the development of the HTCDS. So it's freely available on GitHub. There are 3 parts. There's the field standards, there's guidance and documentation, and then there's a toolkit. And for those of you who've never been on GitHub before, it does look a bit intimidating to start out with. It's not if you give it about 5 minutes. It is basically just a repository that is used by technologists and IT people. They haven't prioritized the look of it. They've more prioritized the usefulness of it. Let's put it like this. So this is what you will see the moment you go online. And basically what we would highly recommend is that you have a look at the introductions, which will give you a better idea of how to use this. And then you start using or start going to the different parts of it. I'll just explain what the field standards does. So if you take a look, you can download this Excel sheet. It basically defines each of the fields in the standard. So each row in the spreadsheet is a field in the standard or in your case management database. So the first part is section, is a category of fields. So what kind of data are we collecting in this one? The status, or it's either draft or released. Core fields are those we think that most systems should have in common. The field name has two parts, a prefix and a field name, so that we know we can find them again. Field label is just basically the explanation for what this is. And then it includes a field name and prefix. And so each of these rows will define what this field means if we go into one of the tools. So the toolkit at the moment consists of 3 elements or 3 different tools. There's an Excel sheet or an Excel database, which is fairly simple. It doesn't have to be in Excel. It can also be used in Google Forms, for instance, if you don't have a subscription to Excel. And it comes in a few different versions with and without validation and drop-down menus. And basically, it allows different organizations to sort of have the basic fields, but also to adjust or add additional fields in case it might be necessary or useful for their case management. So that's the first part. It's a very simple sort of starting point for a database. The next part is survey templates. These can also be used in different formats, but they could be used as screening tools or sort of initial screenings for incoming victims or potential victims of trafficking or survivors of trafficking. And then finally, there's also what's called an unmanned Salesforce package, which is basically a extension. So if you are a hotline, for instance, we realized that quite a lot of hotlines used Salesforce as their basic case management tool. It's not really what it's supposed to be used for, but that's what they were using. And what this does is that it's an additional package that you can download for free and add to Salesforce, if that's the software that you're already using, and it will sort of auto-populate the fields from the field standards. So these are the 3 sort of tools that are currently in the HTCDS toolkit, and we would be quite happy to have feedback on how useful these tools are, of course, but also whether there's a need for additional tools. So on top of the what's on GitHub, we've also developed a survivor case data management training package, which is aligned with the HTCDS, which we already completed with 20 frontline organizations from pretty globally, I would say, from several different countries. These were designed through a partnership with Freedom Collaborative and Recollective. And we've also developed, also with help from Freedom Collective and Recollective, a self-paced e-learning course on case management for frontline organizations. And that's already available on the IOM eCampus, completely free of charge. So what has this been used for? I think Fabrizio already mentioned this, but these are some of the things that we've been using administrative data on TIP for. And I think I will end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tine, for explaining the ICS TIP manual and also the different components of data governance, the human trafficking case data standard, and the toolkit that can help organizations in setting up the case management systems. We are now opening the floor for questions and comments, and we already have a few in the chat box from Karen. Maybe we will start with those. The first question, what are the indications to avoid double counting the same event? I think this was in relation to the ICS tip and the ICCS. A follow-up question to that, what are the indications to count the human trafficking crime together with other crimes that are committed concurrently? For example, extortion, kidnapping, rape, and so on. Yeah, maybe we could start with those and we can go to the other ones. Fabrizio or Stine, whoever wants to take those questions.
I can start and then I'll hand it over to Fabrizio afterwards. I think in terms of avoiding double counting, this is of course an issue across the board, and there's no real indicator for this. I think one of the suggested solutions for this is a unique identifier across different systems. This is not a sort of magic bullet. It's quite hard to do. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But some sort of a unique identifier that isn't linked to the identity of the person. So not names, not birthdays, nothing like that.
Yes, thank you, Stina. The point is that there will always be the risk of double counting during the let's say validation of the data that is collected. Of course, the fact of having a unique identifier and is connected with the event, let's remember we are talking about the event, then this will reduce the risk of double counting. But of course, this is also connected with all data sharing policies, with the fact that the similar event can be registered by one institution and the other institution, then of course there must be also this other passage that is somehow eliminating those events, the same events that is counted twice. But again, let's face that we are having some instruments in the manual, some suggestions in the manual that is reducing the risks of double counting. As far as I think the other question was about other crimes like extortion, kidnapping, and rape. Yeah, I think that this goes also with the other question about the legal definition of the trafficking and how this matches with the organization definition. So this is something that, in a way, starts before the ICS tip enter into place, in the sense that we have an organization that is facing a trafficking event, and the trafficking event, of course, is defined by the organization, whether this is a trafficking event or not. But in principle, we are making use, of course, of the international standards. So United Nations Trafficking Persons Protocol is the universal standard that defines a trafficking case. So once the organization is defining this is an event of trafficking, that we assume is based on the Trafficking Persons United Nations Protocol as universal standard and adopted by 95% of the countries around the world, then the information is feeding according to the indicators. Once the indicators are into the system, then the indicators may refer to extortion or kidnapping as a mean, one of the means that are used by the traffic. But of course, this is again one step before this ICS tip enter into place.
Thank you, Stine and Fabrizio. Karen, you can also check in the question and answer section. Some of your responses have been entered there, the questions that you asked, but there are 3 that are still remaining. The first one is on, is it necessary to conduct a correspondence exercise to assess to what extent the ICS tip matches legal and organizational definitions? And would it be possible to use the case management systems as a source to calculate some of the standardized indicators? I think the first one can go to Fabrizio, the second one can go to Stine.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think this is, of course, an important issue. But again, the standard that we use in ICS TIP is the United Nations Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And let's remember that the Palermo Protocol, the so-called Palermo Protocol, the definition of trafficking according the Palermo Protocol has been adopted by 95% of the countries, that 95% of the member states. So that is the basic understanding that a case of trafficking is following the Palermo Protocol definition. Thanks.
Yes, and in terms of the calculation of the standard indicators, I'm wondering if you mean the standard indicators in terms of the SDGs. Even if you're thinking in terms of the ICS TIP, there is no such thing as any particular goal that you need to reach. But the idea is that the use of the HTCDS by different frontline organizations can potentially, in the long run, feed into a national level centralized system of some kind that is based on the ICS TIP. So in that sense, the idea is that the two of them sort of go hand in hand and will eventually feed into the same sort of outcome. You can use the case management system sort of at the organizational level to better understand the operations of your organization. So if you are a frontline organization, not only is the data useful for research and data purposes and reporting purposes, but also for reporting to donors, for instance. A good case management system is sort of the basis of being able to show what you're doing to your funders.
Thank you, Stine. I think on account of our time, we'll take the last question. What are the implications for any agents to adopt the ICS TIP in terms of training, technical and operational adjustments, economic resources, equipment, and so on? Stine, would you want to take that?
I can start, and then I'll leave it to Fabrizio. I mean, it's a question. It depends on where you're starting from. So if you are starting from no case management system, then you're kind of starting from scratch. If you're starting from a point of having a case management system in place, we would highly recommend a mapping exercise. Or how closely aligned are you already to the ICS TIP? One of the things that we're also keen to emphasize, which we've come across in few of the national trainings, is also that sometimes you have reporting requirements nationally, and particular, for instance, things that are considered, or crimes, activities that are considered a form of trafficking nationally, but not necessarily internationally, at which point you may have to have a system that isn't entirely aligned to the ICS TIP for those elements of trafficking that are not considered trafficking at sort of the international level of per the Palermo Protocol. We do have we are offering trainings and technical and operational advice, not globally, unfortunately, at this point in time, but we're very interested in doing it globally. So there are some sort of adjustments needed in most cases. I don't think there is any specific equipment needed for this, except for statistical software and some sort of data management system.
The purpose of this exercise, as everything that we do as UN agencies, is to support member states and support national authorities. So we welcome and we support the any agencies around the world to adopt these standards. The ICS TIP will be open source, so to say, will be available to everyone, and then we will be happy to provide trainings and support the implementation of the ICS TIP.
Okay, thank you both. The last question, there seems to be ambiguity in understanding TIP and SOM by law enforcement and other stakeholders, despite clear legal definitions in the legal framework of countries. Does the manual deal with this challenge? So I think we would go by Claire's response to that question. Geta, you can check that in the comments section. To close, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time today to participate in this first webinar in the series on trafficking in persons, data and research, and for your active participation. I would also like to thank our excellent speakers, Stine and Fabrizio, for their presentations, and the additional materials provided to advance the discussion on trafficking in persons admin data standards and tools. Last but not least, I would also like to thank all ICAT members for contributing to and promoting the webinar series, the ICAT Secretariat and UNODC Notes Technical Team for their excellent support and hard work to make this happen, and the two 2023 ICAT co-chairs for spearheading this initiative. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.